Topic 1, Part 2, Personal Auto Policy, the Liability, Medical Payments, and Uninsured Underinsured Motorist Coverage section. In this part of Topic 1, we will continue to investigate the auto insurance, in particular the personal auto insurance policy. In today's lesson, we're going to focus the liability, medical payments, and uninsured motorist coverage section. So what is a personal auto policy? It may seem very easy to understand. However, personal auto policy is only designated to insure private passenger autos, and therefore, if you have a business vehicle, that business fleet will not be covered under your personal auto policy. And similarly, if you are using your own vehicle as a taxi so that you can take people from airport to their destination and make some money, or maybe you are part of the Uber program, in those cases, your personal auto policy would not cover those exposures. And you may ask why? Well, because if your vehicle is used as business fleet or it is used as a taxi, the frequency you're going to use that auto is going to be huge. But if you're only using it as personal auto, you only use it to travel from your home to work and from your work to home. You're not necessarily on the road all the time, and therefore your exposure will be relatively lower. So the personal auto policy can only be used to cover private passengers and their drivers, and also some sport utility vehicles designated primarily for use on public roads. So if you have a sport vehicle that is designated to use in the racetrack, it won't be covered under your personal auto policy. Similarly, because it has a larger exposure than the normal personal auto policy. So you then may ask, why not cover it under personal auto policy with higher premium? Well, the reason for that is the normal personal auto policy is rated by several factors that does not include the use as a business, as a taxi, or as a race car. Adding those factors will change the nature of the rating of the personal auto policy. And therefore, it is not very appropriate to use your personal auto policy to cover those exposures. Now you may ask, what about some other policies? Yes, there are some business policies, commercial policies, that would cover your business fleet. As far as for your sport vehicle that is designated to use in a racetrack, the answer is normally those vehicles cannot be covered under regular insurance. But if you have to have it covered, you could use some commercial coverage to cover that. As a result of that, your premium will be higher. So in this course, we will only focus on the personal side of the policy, the personal auto policy. So what does a personal auto policy cover? It includes a declaration page, basically tell you who you are, who the insurance company is, how much premium you're going to pay, when does the policy start and end, and those informations. And then it follows with an agreement and definition page, basically tells what's the guarantee of an insurance company and what your responsibilities are. There are 6 separate sections in a regular policy. Part A, the liability coverage. Part B, medical payments coverage. Part C, uninsured. Part D, damage to your auto coverage. Part E, insurance duties following an accident or loss. And Part F, general provisions. In this chapter, we will focus on Part A, the liability coverage, Part B, the medical payment coverage, and Part C, the uninsured motorist coverage. So the first section of your auto policy will be the declaration page. The information can be found in declaration page include the name of the insurance company, the name of the policyholder or named insured, and the named insured's mailing address, so who you are and where you live. Obviously, where you live is going to make a huge difference for your premium. So if you live in a rural area rather than an urban area, your premium will be relatively lower. It would also tell you the policy period or the time during which the policy provides the coverage. It also tells you what kind of vehicle you have. Do you have any trailers that needs to be specifically insured under the policy? It also tells you the schedule of the coverage and the limit that applies to each listed vehicle with premium for each coverage. However, you need to be very certain that it does not include the agreements and definitions. The agreements and definitions will have its own section. It would not be a part of the declaration page. Some other information that you can find in the declaration page would be any applicable endorsements. Some applicable endorsements include some other mobiles. For example, if you have a snowmobile that is covered under the policy, the snowmobile endorsement would be listed along with the premium for the coverage. It would also tell you the name of the lender, loss payee, or lien holder. For example, sometimes you finance your car through a bank. In this case, the bank would be the lien holder and is usually shown on the declaration page. So if there's a total loss of your car, your bank will get paid. Where your auto is primarily garaged. As I said before, where do you use your vehicle is going to impact your premium. So if you live in an urban area, your premium will be relatively higher. So how can an insurance company know where you're going to use your vehicle? Well, they couldn't. However, the only information they have would be where is your auto primarily garaged. The rating class for the vehicle with any credits and discounts. Any signatures. So the name of the insured, who would be the name of the insured? It could be any individual whose name shows on the declaration page. Or it could be any unnamed married couple. For example, if a husband go and purchase a new car and get a new policy to cover his vehicle. However, he forgot to put his wife's name on the policy declaration page. The question will be, will the wife be covered under this policy? The answer is yes. So even though the wife's name is not specifically listed in the declaration page, the unnamed married couple's name would also be covered in the policy. It could also be any other parties. For example, if you are buying your car through a loan with a bank, then the bank's name would also be listed. So what would be the named insured's responsibilities and rights? Well, you're going to have to pay your premium. During the time, you could request a cancellation, and then the rest of the premium may or may not be returned to you. You can also receive any notice issued by the insured. For example, during the policy period, by law, the insurance company may have to change the policy provisions, and the insurance company will therefore issue a notice to you. So you may then have a right to get the notice issued by the insurance company for an update of the policy. So when does the policy period usually start and end? It could be any time during a year, and the period usually lasts either half a year or 1 year. The policy period usually starts in the middle of the night, and it will end also in the middle of the night. So the time will comply with the time zone where your policy becomes effective, and usually it is where the address is listed on the policy. So how would your premium be influenced? There are certain rating information in the declaration page so that they would reduce the premium, such as you have multiple cars. If you're living alone but have more than one car, the chances are you're only going to use one car at a time, and therefore having more than one car will reduce your premium for each of your car. If you have attend the driver training, it will reduce your premium. If you're a student and you have a good GPA, it would also help to reduce your premium. If you take a defense driving course or use an anti-theft devices, they will also help to reduce your premium. Using passive restraints, such as an automatic safety device, such as an airbag, in a motor vehicle that would protect a person during a crash, would also help to reduce the premium. After the declaration page, the second part of the personal auto policy is the definitions. It defines some words, for example, you and your. Normally, a married couple would be together considered as you. We, us, will be considered as the insurance company. If the vehicle is leased, and what is considered as bodily injury? What is a business considered? What would family member be considered? What is occupied considered? What is a property damage? What would be a trailer? How would a trailer be covered? What would be your covered auto? And if you purchase a new auto, how would that be covered? So we're going to investigate these definitions one by one. So who would be the insured that is considered as you in the auto policy? Any of the named insured would be covered. An unnamed spouse, as long as they live in the same household, would also be covered. So in this case, you have to be very specific that if the spouse is living in the same household as the insured. And it doesn't matter if the spouse name is listed. However, if the spouse moved out for any reason, the spouse would be considered as you or your only within a specific time. So after 90 days, after the spouse has changed their residency, the coverage for the spouse will expire. And if the spouse went out and get another policy, as soon as the new policy starts to be effective, the elder policy would expire. And of course, by the end of the policy period, the spouse policy would expire. Family member would be considered as any person who is related to the named insured or spouse by blood. So your son, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles would all be considered as your family member, as long as they live in the same household as you do. So as you see, there are two requirements for the family members. First, their name needs to be listed. And second, they need to live in the same household as the insured. So for a full-time student, they would still be considered as the resident of the same household. However, if the student has graduated and find a job, in this case, the student, the kid, the child would no longer be considered as a family member and therefore would not be covered under the original auto policy. What about the bodily injury? It refers to any type of bodily harm if you're injured, any sickness due to the collision, any disease, including the death. And the bodily injury definition would refer to in Part A liability coverage. So if you hit someone and someone else got harmed, and that would be referring to your Part A liability coverage. And it will also influence the Part B medical payments. So the medical payments Part B would cover your own medical expenses. And it will also impact Part C, the uninsured motorist coverage. So what is considered as occupying? In insurance, we don't call it as riding because there are many things that could happen even though you're not riding. For example, you are trying to get on the car and someone hit you from behind before you enter the car, but you are trying to get into the car. You got hurt. Would that be covered? Well, from the perspective of insurance, it will be covered because you will be considered as occupying the car. So occupying would include being inside of the car, up on the car, getting into the car, on the car, out of the car, getting off the car. So if in a parking lot, you're trying to get on the car and you're still outside of the car and you got hurt, you were hit by someone, that will still be considered as occupying and therefore will be covered by your auto insurance. And the definition of occupying is related with Part B, the medical payments, Part C, uninsured motorist coverage. Next, what would a trailer be? A trailer would be any vehicle designated to pull by your car. Your car could be any van, a pickup truck, or a private passenger auto. The definition of the trailer also include any farm wagon or farm implement towed by a vehicle included in the definition of a trailer. What would be your car? Your covered auto. It applies to any vehicle that are covered under the personal auto policy. It could be any kind of vehicle shown in the declaration. It could be your trailer. It could even be your temporary substitute auto or trailer. And therefore, if you're having a vacation somewhere else and you're driving a rental car, that rental car would be automatically covered under your own vehicle coverage. And that is because it is a temporary substitute of your auto. Your covered auto would also include the newly acquired auto. So if you go ahead and purchase a new car, the new car would also be covered under your previous auto policy within a specific period of time. The temporary substitute auto or trailer is used as a short-term substitute. So obviously, if you're using it for long term, it would no longer be covered under your previous vehicle. And therefore, you need to get a new policy to cover that. So talking about the newly acquired auto, sometimes your old vehicle is not very expensive, so you have selected not to cover the physical damage to the vehicle. What if you purchase a new car that you want to cover the new car's physical damage? Well, the newly acquired auto provision says that the physical damage to the new car would also be covered. So there are two scenarios. First, if you carry a collision or other than collision for your own car, so the new auto would be covered under the broadest coverage, meaning if you have more than one vehicle, the new vehicle will be covered under the broadest coverage, and it can be covered for as long as 14 days. However, if your previous car do not have any collision coverage, in this case, your new auto will still be covered for a collision coverage, but there will be a $500 deductible, and it will only be covered for 4 days. So after 4 days, you're going to have to get a new policy to cover that. So as you see, the difference is the time of the period your new car will be covered and how much it will be covered. Your newly acquired auto can be any of the following two types. It could be a private passenger auto. It could also be a pickup or a van for which no other insurance policy provides coverage. So you may ask, what is the difference between additional auto and replacement auto? Well, it depends on what you do with your previous car. If you're going to use your previous car, so now you have more than one vehicle to use, and that new vehicle would be an additional auto. However, if you're not using your previous car, you could either trade in or do something else with it. In this case, your new car will be a replacement auto. Depending on how you use your old car would influence the new car's coverage. So if you want your previous policy to cover your new car, an additional auto will be automatically covered for 14 days. However, you need to request the coverage beyond 14 days. So the additional auto will have its own policy to cover it. Otherwise, it may be illegal to drive. A replacement auto, however, is covered for the remainder of the policy period. So you could transfer your old car's policy to the new car if you trade in the old car or if you decide not to use the old car. However, you want to be very specific because certain states if you do not use any car as long as it can be used, even though it's just a dead storage, you still need to get an insurance policy to cover that car. So you might want to check with your state's requirement. A temporary substitute auto or trailer is used as a short-term substitute. It could be any time when you're on a vacation, your rental car, or it could be that your own vehicle is for repair and therefore you need a temporary substitute. And that would also be covered under the temporary substitute auto or trailer. And it is covered under all your PAP coverage except the damage to your auto. Because, for example, you may not have the physical damage to your auto, to your own vehicle, and therefore your temporary substitute may not enjoy the physical damage part. The first section of an insurance coverage for the personal auto policy is the Part A, liability coverage. It provides protection, not for you, but for the person who you have the legal liability arise out of your ownership, maintenance, or the use of your vehicle. So if you hit someone and that person got injured and he sues you, it will trigger your liability coverage. So the provisions of the personal auto vehicle Part 8 would be the insuring agreement, supplementary payments, exclusions, limit of liability, out-of-state coverage, financial responsibility, and other insurance. And we will talk about each of these 7 bullet points in detail. The insuring agreement section includes the following 2 items: the damage and defense costs covered, and the person and organization insured. The damage and defense costs covered include both compensatory damage and punitive exemplary damage, and they also include any prejudgment interest. So there are 2 types of interest. There is a prejudgment interest, and there's also a post-judgment interest. The prejudgment interest will be covered under the damage and defense cost. The prejudgment interest is awarded against the insured to allow plaintiffs, who is the injured person who files a suit against you, to receive interest from the time accident occurs until the judgment is handed down. So to put it in a simple word is, if you hit someone and cause someone physical injury, in this case, he will need some dollar amount of money to treat his injury. and the prejudgment interest will help him to pay for that. For an example, your auto policy has an $100,000 limit of liability, and the insured is legally reliable for $95,000. With that, there's also a $10,000 of prejudgment interest. In this case, the personal auto policy will only cover that $100,000 limit of liability. And therefore, the prejudgment interest actually goes to your liability limit. The insuring agreement also tells who are the persons and organizations insured. It would be the named insured and any family member, and it also includes any person using a covered vehicle and any person or organization, but only for a legal liability arising out of an insured person's use of a covered auto on behalf of that person or organization. So for example, you deliver a mail for your employer. During the time, you have injured someone while you're driving to deliver the mail, and that someone sues you and your employer. In this case, both you and your employer will be covered under your personal auto policy. Finally, any person or organization that is legally reliable and responsible for the named insured's or a family member's use of any auto or trailer would also be covered under the liability coverage. Unlike the prejudgment interest, the supplementary payment, including the post-judgment interest, is not going to reduce the limit of the liability. It includes the following 5 items. So the supplementary payment will help to pay for the cost of bail bonds. So after an accident that results in bodily injury or property damage, you may incur a cost of bail bonds, and that supplementary payment would help to pay for that. It would also include the premiums on appeal bonds and the bonds or to release attachments in a lawsuit defended by the insurer, the interest accrued, loss of earning, and other reasonable expenses. The premiums on appeal bonds and bonds to release attachments in a lawsuit defended by the insured, meaning that during a legal proceeding, the plaintiff, the victim, may place an attachment on the insured's property, such as a vehicle. A release of attachment bond guarantees that the insured will pay any judgment, and therefore permitting a release of the attachment on the insured's property. The interest accrued on damages after a judgment has been entered into a court and before the money is paid. An example of that is if an insured appeals a lawsuit, any interest that accrues after judgment becomes payable to the plaintiff by the insured. The insured will pay this amount on behalf of the insured separately from the liability judgment, and the amount paid will not reduce the limit of the liability. To put it short, the supplementary payments, those 5 bullet points, they are not going to reduce the limit of liability. There are certain exclusions for the liability coverage, and I will give you some example of all the exclusions. First, intentional injury. For example, Jim is enraged, and because he is caught in a traffic jam, and he deliberately rams the vehicle in front of him. In this case, Jim's personal auto policy would not cover this liability loss because he engaged in an intentional injury. Second, property owned or transport. Sue is driving during a vacation time, and her luggage and clothes are damaged when Sue is negligent and causes an auto accident. In this case, Sue's personal auto policy would not cover this property loss. Third, property rented to, used by, or in the care of the insured. For example, Bill has rented some glassware for a party, and those glassware are damaged during he is carrying those glasswares in his car and involved in an accident. In this case, Bill's personal auto policy would not cover this liability loss. Fourth, bodily injury to an employee of the insured. And there's an exception of the exclusion. That would be the domestic worker. What does that mean? So usually, if you work for any employer and during the time of the employment, you're transporting. So if you cause a bodily injury, the transportation for your employer would not be covered. However, there's an exception if you have a domestic worker. That domestic worker's transportation would be covered. For example, Anne is an employee and she is injured during the course of employment. Anne's PAP will not cover this liability loss if there is workers' compensation insurance that would otherwise cover the loss. However, if Anne's employer is a person who employs Anne as a domestic worker, and there's no workers' compensation to cover this domestic worker, and in this case, Anne will be covered. Fifth, public or livery conveyance, such as a taxi or a bus. So if you use your vehicle as a taxi, it would not be covered. So for example, Tom uses his auto to regularly transport travelers from the airport for a specific fee. On one trip, he collided with a parked truck. In this case, Tom's personal auto policy would not cover the liability loss. Sixth, garage business use. However, there is an exception of the exclusion, the covered auto being driven by the named insured. So let me give you some example. If John repairs auto for his customers, during a road testing of a customer's auto, John collided with a parked car. John's personal auto policy would not cover the liability loss. However, the garage business exclusion does not apply to the insured's covered auto when it is being driven by the named insured. So for example, if Josh owns an auto service center, a customer dropped off a car for repair one morning, and Josh has agreed to drive the customer to the customer's office. Josh used his personal car insured by a personal auto policy PAP to do this. While driving the customer to work, Josh got into an auto accident with another car in which the customer and the other driver were injured. In this case, Josh's personal auto policy would apply to the loss. So to put it simple, you could use your personal auto policy to cover garage business use only if you are driving your own vehicle. Other business use is also not covered. So if Sarah drives a school bus and injures a pedestrian, Sarah's PAP would not cover this liability loss. Finally, vehicles used without reasonable belief of being entitled. So for example, Bob's son uses keys that have been left in a parked car and goes for a joyride that results in an accident. In this case, Bob's personal auto policy will not cover the liability loss because his son do not have a reasonable belief to use the car who is simply parked there. So the car is not Bob's and not his son's. Here are some more exclusions. First, the nuclear energy liability losses. For example, Tom has accidentally driven his vehicle into a nuclear energy facility. Although it could be relatively rare, but it has caused the release of harmful radiation. he could potentially be considered and insured under that facility's nuclear energy liability policy and be covered for damage. And therefore, his personal auto policy would not cover that nuclear energy related liability losses. Second, any vehicles with fewer than 4 wheels or designated for off-road use would not be covered. For example, Mary drives a motorcycle and negligently collided with a parked truck. In this case, Mary's personal auto policy would not cover the liability loss, and therefore, Mary should otherwise get a new auto policy for his motorcycles. Third, other vehicles owned by the insured or available for the insured's regular use. For example, John owns a car and a truck, but listed only the car in the policy declaration and pays the premium only for the car. If John damaged the other auto while negligently driving his truck, which is not listed, in this case, John's PAP would not cover this liability loss. Fourth, the vehicles owned by or available for family members' regular use. For example, Bert lives with Sam. Sam borrows Bert's car, owned and insured by Bert, and damaged the other car. Sam's personal auto policy will cover this liability loss as an excess over the Bert's personal auto policy. So in an event that two auto policy would potentially be triggered, which one will be triggered first? The good rule of thumb would be it should always follow the vehicle. So for example, if I am using your car and had an accident, so your car's auto policy will be triggered first. If it is not enough, then my policy will be triggered. And that's why I said it follows the vehicle. Finally, racing would not be covered. So if Paul used his auto inside a racing facility to practice for a race, he takes his Corvette to a commercial drag strip to see how fast it can accelerate. In this case, Paul loses control of his car and damages another racing car. In this case, Paul's personal auto policy would not cover this liability loss. The liability limit is usually listed in thousands of dollars with slashes in between. So there are 3 sections. The first section means the bodily injury for each person in the vehicle. So it's a $100,000 limit in our case. So it's listed in thousands of dollars. And the second one means the bodily injury to all the persons in each accident. So in total, all of you would get paid for $300,000. And the last one would be the property damage in each accident. Let's take a look at example. In this case, you may wish to write down the numbers. Let's begin. Rosa's sedan is covered by a personal auto policy with split limits for liability coverage of 100 slash 300 slash 50 slash. And Rosa's friend Lamont owns a sports car that is covered by PAP with a split limit with 25 slash 50 slash and 10. Rosa borrowed Lamont's sports car and caused an accident with another vehicle driven by James. James and his passenger Fred were injured and they filed a suit against Rosa. The court has awarded $35,000 to James for his bodily injuries and $110,000 to Fred for his bodily injuries. How much will be paid under each policy? So let's take a look at this example. Eventually, there are 110 and $45,000 of court award for both James and his passenger Fred's injuries, and that has well go beyond the policy limit of Lamont, which is $50,000 for the whole vehicle. And therefore, all of Lamont's policy limit will be released, that is $50,000. And the rest of it, $95,000, will be paid under Rosa's policy. Now, as you see, even though Rosa is the one who triggered the accident, it's actually getting paid first under Lamont's policy because the vehicle belongs to Lamont. We drive our car to some other states from time to time. So what happens if the state that we're driving in has a different financial responsibility law than our home state? Well, the liability coverage will cover the out-of-state coverage. It applies when you drive your auto and the accident occurs in a state other than your home state. So if the accident occurs in a state that has a financial responsibility law or a similar law that requires a higher liability limit, then your personal auto policy will automatically provide a higher required limit for that accident. Sometimes you may have more than one insurance to cover your vehicle. For example, we said that the couples will be covered under each other's policy, named or unnamed. So you could be covered under your husband's policy, and your husband could be also covered under your policy. In this case, you will have two insurance to cover the same accident. How would the accident be paid under the two policies? Well, they will be paid proportionally. So the other insurance provision applies with more than one auto policy that covers a liability claim. As we said before, sometimes one policy pays first, the other policy pays second, depending on what car you're driving. So it always follows the car. But other than that, all the policy pays at the same time, but proportionally, depending on their liability limit. For example, you are driving a rental car. So it is neither your car nor your husband's car. However, you are covered under your own auto policy and your husband's auto policy. In this case, both of them could be triggered to pay for your rental car's liability coverage, and they will be contributed proportionally. For example, if your own car has $10,000 limit and your husband's car has a $20,000 limit, see, your auto policy will pay 1/3 of the total loss, and your husband's policy will pay 2/3 of the total loss. However, it's not going to exceed the total liability limit. Let's look at another example. Again, you may wish to write the numbers down to help you to figure out the example. Let's begin. Joseph accidentally injures another motorist while driving his own vehicle and must pay damage of $60,000. Assume that Joseph has a personal auto policy with $100,000 of limit with insurance company A, and he also has a personal auto policy with $50,000 limit with policy B. If two of the auto liability policies cover the same owned vehicle, and each insurer pays its pro rata share, how much would each pay? Well, insurance company A would pay 2/3 of the total loss, which will be $40,000. Company B will pay 1/3 of the total loss, which is $20,000. The second part, Part B, medical payments coverage, pay for your own medical expenses during an accident. So it could be your fault or not your fault because it's paying the first party damage, not the third party damage. For example, if you have an accident and you collided with someone and you injured both yourself and the passenger in the other vehicle, if it turns out to be your fault, in this case, the other vehicle's passenger will trigger the Part A liability payment because it's your liability. However, Part B will cover your own medical expenses. So the Part B is actually not a liability coverage because it is a first party coverage, whereas the liability coverage is a third party coverage. Under Part B, the insurance company agrees to pay only those expenses incurred for services rendered within 3 years from the date of the accident. Now, you may ask why there's a 3 years of a limit. Well, there are two reasons. First, after an accident, an injury may emerge not immediately. However, it is not highly unlikely to emerge after 3 years. So any symptom that start to show up after 3 years can most likely not be as a result of the accident and therefore should not be paid under your vehicle's policy. And second, any symptom emerged after 3 years will have a suspicious of an insurance fraud. Could it be a symptom that you have faked so that you can get paid by the previous accident? And therefore, insurance company put a 3 years threshold, says after the 3 years, any symptom emerged would not be covered. The Part B of personal auto policy include the following provisions. As usual, it has the insuring agreements. It also has exclusions, very similar as the first part, and limits of liability, and it also tells how much to pay under each insurance. Part B medical payments coverage covers two classes of insureds: the named insured and family members, and any other person while occupying a covered vehicle. So the family members are individuals who are covered for their medical expenses if they're injured while occupying a motor vehicle or as a pedestrian when struck by a motor vehicle designated for use mainly on the public roads. Examples of a covered loss includes injuries to the named insured in an auto accident, the injury of a family member's hand when a neighbor's car door shuts on it, an injury of a family member suffer when a truck was hitting it while crossing the street. Any other persons while occupying the covered auto will be covered, and it covers the medical expenses of any passengers. It could be your family member, and it could be anyone else. For example, if Mary owns her car and is named the insured, all the passengers in her car are covered for their medical expenses under her policy. However, if Mary is operating a vehicle she does not own, the passengers in the car will not be covered under Mary's medical payments coverage. They will, however, be covered under the vehicle in which Mary is operating in's policy. The passengers in the non-owned vehicles can seek protection under their own policies or under the medical payments that applies to the non-owned vehicle. So as you can see, we could summarize the medical payment in the following ways. For the family members, they are covered for any auto-related accidents. It could be the covered vehicle and it could be any other vehicle. But for other persons, they're only covered when they're occupying the covered vehicle. The medical payments coverage also consists with some exclusions. Many of the exclusions, Part B, are similar to those under Part A. So the first exclusion that is specifically in Part D will be the motorized vehicle with fewer than 4 wheels. For example, John is an owner of a car insured under a PAP that includes the medical payment coverage. A friend of his loaned his motorcycle to John for a weekend ride, and John was injured while riding the motorcycle. In this case, John's PAP would not cover the medical bill because John is not operating a four-wheel vehicle. Second, the public livery or conveyance. For an example, Jackie had been having trouble paying her bills and decided to do a secondary job as a taxi driver. She was involved in a collision with a van, and her fare-paying passenger was injured. Jackie's car was insured with a PAP that include medical payments coverage. However, Jackie's passengers will not be covered under the medical payments because Jackie was engaging in public or livery conveyance. If you use your covered vehicle as a residence or premises, it would not get paid. And if you use your vehicle and injury occurring during the course of employment, if there is workers' compensation there, then your PAP would not be triggered. For example, if Rosa is injured while driving her car on a business trip and her employer provides workers' compensation benefits, those benefits, rather than Rosa's own PAP medical payment coverage, will apply. So her PAP would pay nothing. The medical payments coverage also excludes the vehicle furnished or made available for the regular use of any family member. For example, your dad, who is living with you, is hurt when driving in your car. In this case, your dad's policy will pay first because your car is now furnished to made available for the regular use of your father. It does not cover the occupying of a vehicle without a reasonable belief of being entitled to do so. So if someone has stolen your card and drive away, and during the procedure he hit someone else and got injured, in this case, your personal auto policy shall not pay the car thief's injury. Thirdly, any vehicle used in business or uninsured would not be covered. Any nuclear weapons, war, nuclear reaction, radiation would not be covered. If you're occupying a vehicle located inside a racing facility, your medical payment coverage would not be triggered. Finally, if you're using other vehicles owned by you or available for your regular use, for example, if a named insured owns two cars, one is covered by PAP and one has no insurance at all. If he is driving the vehicle with no insurance at all, the one that with the PAP policy would not be triggered to cover his injury because he selected not to cover the other car with the PAP coverage. The last part that we're going to talk about in this chapter is part C, the uninsured motorist coverage. It helps to compensate your injuries and your family member's injury if it is caused by an at-fault uninsured motorist, a hit-and-run driver, or a driver whose insurance company went insolvent. The basic PAPUM usually include the following provisions: the insuring agreement, the exclusions, the limit of liability, and other insurance. Arbitration. The insuring agreement includes the following aspects: who the insured person is. As usual, you will be covered. Your unnamed spouse will be covered. Your family will also be covered if their names are shown in the insuring agreement. It would also include the uninsured motor vehicles. So the insured person would be covered for the uninsured motorist coverage of the PAP. And the person would be the named insured and your family members, your unnamed spouse, any other persons occupying a covered vehicle, any person legally entitled to recover damage because of bodily injury to a person described in either of the preceding groups. For example, your surviving spouse would have the right to recover for your loss in the uninsured motorist coverage. So first, let's look at certain terminologies. What would be an uninsured motor vehicle? It's any type of land motor vehicle, so it does not cover if you have a boat accident. It could also be any trailer of any type that meets any of the underlying criteria. First, there is no bodily injury liability insurance or bond applicable. So if there is any insurance applicable, the uninsured motorist vehicles coverage would not be covered. And second, the bodily injury liability policy or bond is enforced, but the limit of the bodily injury liability is less than the minimum amount required by the state law. And thirdly, the vehicle could be a hit and run. And finally, the bodily injury liability policy or bond applies at the time of the accident, but the insurance or the bonding company denies the coverage, or it has become insolvent. Sometimes you may have more than one vehicle. So how would the limit of liability be triggered from all of your 3 cars or more than 3 cars? Well, the coverage prevents stacking. What does that mean? Let's take a look at this example. The insured owns 3 cars that are covered by PAP with a limit of $25,000 per person. If the insured is injured by an uninsured motorist, the most that the insured can recover is $25,000, not $75,000, even though he has 3 cars. So he can only get the highest of any of his 3 cars, and he can get it only once. So he cannot trigger all of the 3 cars coverage. What about the other insurance? The total amount paid will not be more than the highest limit of any of the policies that provide a coverage, such as we've talked before. And if the insured is on a vehicle that he does not own, his insurance will be provided on an excess base. So basically, that particular vehicle's coverage will be triggered first. And if it is not enough, the insured's own coverage will be applied. For example, assume that Lewis has a coverage with limits of $50,000 and $100,000. He is injured by an uninsured motorist while riding in Gary's car. Gary, however, has $25,000 and $50,000 of coverage. Now, if Lewis is entitled to $35,000 for his bodily injuries, then Gary's insurance company will pay first because, as we said before, it will follow the vehicle first. Since Gary's car is the one that is being driven, it will follow Gary's car first. And so Gary's insurance company will pay the first $25,000 going up to the limit of Gary's insurance as the primary insurance. And then Lewis Insurance Company will pay the remaining $10,000 as an excess insurance. Sometimes the insured and the insurance company may not agree on whether the insured agrees. Sometimes the insurance company and the insured cannot agree on whether to pay and how much to pay. In this case, they can go through a process called arbitration. So arbitration is actually a process settling the disagreements between the insured and the insurance company. In this case, both the insured and the insurance company will select an arbitrator, who together will select a third arbitrator. So the three arbitrators will then decide whether and how much the uninsured motorist coverage will apply. Any decision agreed by two of the three arbitrators will be binding. And it can only be binding as long as the amount of damage does not exceed the minimum limit for bodily injury specified by the state's financial responsibility law. If that's not the case, then each party can demand a right to a trial. So here we conclude this chapter, the first part of auto policy. In the next chapter, we will continue to investigate the auto policy, but we're going to talk about the physical damage to your vehicle part.